based upon your review of this incident, do you believe that the restraint should have ended at some point in the encounter?
Grounds?
Thank you, Your Honor. And sir, getting back to some of your duties as a shift sergeant in conducting force reviews, when you conduct a force review, you typically visit the scene, is that right?
Yes.
Interview witnesses, correct?
Yes.
Gather all the information, body-worn cameras, correct?
Yes.
And review that footage, correct?
Yes.
And make a preliminary determination as to whether or not it would be necessary to forward this for for a review by internal affairs. Is that right?
Yes.
And if you review some body-worn camera footage and find there's nothing to review, you wouldn't forward that to internal affairs.
If I was doing a force report, I believe it would go down there anyway. All force reports do.
Would also go to internal affairs.
Correct.
If you review body-worn camera footage and determine that use of force might have been excessive, do you make a recommendation to internal affairs?
Yes. In that case, you'd have to contact internal affairs.
I submit the foundation, Your Honor.
Okay. Members of the jury, I'm going to have you take a break while we figure out a fairly sticky legal issue here. We'll have you back fairly soon. All right, we are outside the hearing of the jury. Be seated, please. Mr. Nelson has asked for an opportunity to voir dire the witness for a possible objection outside the hearing of the jury. Mr. Nelson.
Good afternoon, Sergeant Pleoger.
Good afternoon, sir.
So in the normal course of your duties as a police sergeant in reviewing the use of force, what you're describing is what you would normally do, correct?
Yes.
So if a use of force is reported to you by an officer, in those circumstances, this use of force review occurs by the shift supervisor, correct?
Yes.
And the shift supervisor would first and foremost report to the scene, correct?
Yes.
After that point, you would interview the officers that were involved, correct?
Yes.
You may interview the person upon whom force was used, right?
Yes.
You may interview witnesses to the use of force if they exist, correct?
Yes.
You may review body-worn cameras, other evidence, photographs, whatever else may be a part of that process, right?
Yes.
And it is much greater in it's a limited, but it's a bigger scope, right?
Yes.
When a use of force incident becomes a critical incident, however, does your role change?
I would no longer do a use of force in a critical incident,
Right.
nor would I do it if someone had suffered an injury, if they were handcuffed. That goes up the chain then to lieutenant and internal affairs.
Okay. So in certain circumstances, you would not be required to do that, right?
Correct.
And also, in addition, Your Honor, or Sergeant Pleoger, I apologize, you did not do any of that use of force review on May 25th of 2020, did you?
No.
You didn't speak with the officers in depth about what happened, correct?
No.
You didn't interview any of the witnesses that were at the scene, did you?
No.
And you didn't review the body-worn cameras that night, did you?
No.
In preparation for your testimony, were you given the entirety of the case file for this case?
No.
I mean, do you have 50,000 pages of police reports?
No.
Have you reviewed any of the interviews from any of the witnesses?
No.
Have you reviewed any of the statements that were given relevant to this case by any of the involved officers from those who did give statements?
No.
All right. So in this case, in preparation, were you allowed to watch the entirety of all of the body-worn cameras?
I think I did.
Okay. And that was in preparation or while you were being interviewed with the state prosecutors, right?
Correct.
Okay. So in terms of the information you have a a limited amount of information, which would be limited to just a review of the body-worn cameras.
Yes.
And that would not be the normal course for a sergeant's use of force review.
Yes.
I'm still not clear as to who made the decision in this case. So, Mr. Swisher, I don't have very much of a foundation for who gave this opinion, or gave an opinion in this case. Could you follow up with?
I'm sorry, I had a hard time hearing.
I don't think I have a foundation yet. It sounds like on a critical incident, it gets passed up. Who made? I don't know who made the decision on use of force.
Well, there wasn't.
Could you maybe inquire, see where we're at?
I can, Your Honor. I want to just clean up one part of the record first. In terms of reviewing the body-worn camera footage with the state, I think the question was state prosecutors. You didn't review them with the state prosecutors, but you have reviewed those with prosecutors. Is that correct?
Correct.
Right. Other prosecutors, not associated with this particular case.
Right.
Is that right?
Yes.
Now, to answer the court's question, in terms of whether or not you did a use of force review pursuant to the policy, in this particular case, you did not, correct?
Correct.
Right? You passed the scene along and followed the critical incident policy, per the critical incident guidelines. Is that right?
Yes.
However, in the course of your duties as a shift sergeant, you do force reviews. Is that right?
Yes.
You follow the policy in conducting supervisory force reviews.
Yes.
Right? And if we could pull up the exhibit again, 222. You could go to the next page, please. Okay. In conducting a force review, if you could please call out Roman I. You contact the internal affairs unit commander by phone if the force used appears to be unreasonable or constitute possible misconduct. Is that right?
Yes.
So you make a threshold assessment of whether or not force is excessive or could constitute possible misconduct. True?
True.
And if you could go to the next page. And call out B. And again, based on the totality of information available at the time, if you as a supervisor feel that the use of force may have been unreasonable or not within policy, you can state so in your supervisory force review. Is that right?
Yes.
And that's the policy that you follow.
Yes.
And so, Your Honor, I don't believe that this is a lack of foundation. He has clearly qualified to give an opinion, and a limited opinion, that based on his preliminary review, as stated and disclosed, he believed that the restraint should have ended very shortly after Mr. Floyd was taken to the ground, handcuffed, and no longer resisting. And that's the sum and substance of the opinion I intend to offer.
If I could just follow a couple questions. In this particular case, the reason you called the lieutenant was because Mr. Floyd died, right?
I would have called the lieutenant first because force was used and he was in handcuffs. Any force that results or that's used when somebody's in handcuffs requires me to call the lieutenant and internal affairs.
Right. So that went up the chain naturally that way. And then when Mr. Floyd died, this use of force policy is replaced with the critical incident policy. Is
Yes.
that correct? So, Your Honor, I guess the issue here is this is exactly what the motions in limine were designed to effectuate. This officer, Sergeant Pleoger, did not make this determination. he has not done a use of force review as he would have done in this policy. He has not reviewed the entirety of the evidence in this particular case. And while he may have seen certain body camera footage and made some determination based on that limited information, he hasn't seen everything else. And so it is not within his purview. This is what the motion in limine was specifically designed for.
Mr. Slisher, as I understood it, you're asking a narrower opinion?
That's correct, Your Honor. I'm asking, exactly what I proffered, that in his opinion, the force should have ended very shortly after Mr. Floyd was on the ground, handcuffed in the prone position and no longer resistant.
You can ask that one question. Let's bring the jury back. Is this probably going to be our last witness? How long is that?
Another one in the hall. We could get him done in a half hour.
Okay. True. Okay. We'll see how it goes. All right, previous questions withdrawn. Mr. Slisher, would you ask your question?